Welcome, everyone. And my name is Daniela Rosendo, and I'm honored to be here. And we will start another plenary, and we'll have a special guest today, Professor Elizabeth Kassab, and we will hear her conference. And Professor, we are pleased to have you here. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And Professor Elizabeth Suzanne Kassab studied philosophy at the American University of Beirut and the University of Fribourg, Switzerland. She taught in Lebanon at the American University of Beirut and Balamand University, and has been a visiting professor at a number of universities in Europe and the US, including Bonn, Columbia, Yale, and Brown. She has been a Fulbright Fellow at the New School University in New York City, a research fellow at the German Orient Institute in Beirut, a visiting research fellow at the universities of Bielefeld and Erfurt. Please correct my spelling there. At the Berlin Graduate School of Muslim Cultures and Societies of the Free University of Berlin, at the Kat-Gemoge Center for Advanced Study in the Humanities in Bonn, and the Marburg Research Network, Reconfigurations, History, Remembrance, and Transformation Processes in the Middle East and North Africa. She has been a faculty member of the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies since October 2006. Her research interests center on Western and post-colonial philosophies of culture, with a particular focus on contemporary Arab thought and philosophy. She has received the 2013 Sheikh Zayed Book Award in Abu Dhabi in the category of Contribution to Development of Nations from the Arabic version of her book, Contemporary Arab Thought, Cultural Critique in Comparative Perspective, Columbia University Press, 2010. Her new book is entitled Enlightenment on the Eve of Revolution, the Egyptian and Syrian Debates, published by Columbia University Press in 2019. So again, thank you very much for being here today with us, Professor Elizabeth, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniela. Actually, I'm delighted to participate in this conference from the other end of the world, actually. And when Thalita contacted me, I thought, what is this voice coming from the other side of the planet? And so I'm delighted to be here. And so I will be speaking about, like the title of my talk indicates, I will be speaking about contemporary Arab thought, Arab philosophy, and about enlightenment and humanism. So I will start with a long introduction, if you wish, about contemporary Arab philosophy. I will characterize a little bit this philosophy during the 20th century, and then towards the end, I will speak about enlightenment and humanism. Okay, so I think most of you and most people in general have heard of Islamic philosophy. Names like Averroes, Avicenna, Ibn Khaldun, and so on. These are names that are quite well known across the world. But this is the old Islamic medieval classical philosophy. Very little is known about the contemporary or the modern Arab thought and philosophy in particular. And unfortunately, this is not the case only for the world, but also people in this part of the world, the Arabic-speaking world, also doesn't know much about it because, well, for many reasons, because it's considered not to be that important, because it's not taught, it's not written about much. So it has been my life campaign to write about this philosophy. So I will basically speak about the 20th century. And the introduction of modern philosophy into the modern Arabic-speaking world started with the colonial or mandate forces, late 19th century, early 20th century, when universities were established, some by colonial powers, some by newly independent governments. We got independent, supposedly, in the 40s, 50s, 60s. You guys in Latin America were ahead of us by about a century, getting your liberation from the European powers. So as these universities got established, philosophy departments were also set in place. And at the beginning, we had some foreign professors in Egypt, especially in Egypt, in the North Africa. And then slowly governments started to send students to Europe to study philosophy, to Paris, basically mostly to Paris and some to Britain. And these young men, of course, they were all men, they came back to their countries and became the professors of philosophy in their countries. In Syria, in Lebanon, in Egypt, also in North Africa. And these people obviously had to learn foreign languages, European languages, French, English, sometimes German. And I think there is a difference between the first part of the 20th century and the second part. In the first part, the first half of the 20th century, people were concerned with introducing modern philosophy into the Arab world. And this meant teaching it and translating it. So these young men who came back from Paris or from London started teaching this material and started translating texts. However, with the independence, or with the start of the second half of the century, philosophy became more burdened with local problems, social problems, political problems, cultural problems. And people who replaced or succeeded to those professors were rather, many of them, let's say, had studied in their own countries. Their foreign languages were not that good, and they proliferated with the extension of the state universities, which opened up, in an effort to democratize higher education, to open universities in the provinces, a step that was not very well studied and which led really to the drop of the level of instruction. And in general, with the deterioration of the state of the post-independent states, education in general suffered, and with it, the philosophy, the teaching of philosophy and researching it. And there is one concern I would like to underline here, since we are in a Latin American context here. There was, starting, the mid-century, mid-20th century, the concern with indigenization, the search of for a philosophy of one's own. In other words, that, okay, you had studied European modern philosophy, you had come back to your countries, and then the question was, okay, do we have a philosophy of our own? And what would that mean? Now, I want to go back to a conference that took place in New York in 1947. It was the Inter-American Congress of Philosophy. And this Inter-American Congress of Philosophy joined South American and North American philosophers. This Congress might be known to some of you. And in 1947, it was the second meeting of the Congress. The topic was the following: that Europe had collapsed. We are, 2 years after the end of the Second World War. So the center of civilization, and with it, the center of philosophy, has collapsed. And the main question of the Congress was, who is to take up the leadership after Europe? Now, it's interesting that the North Americans, the proceedings are published and everybody can read it. The North Americans' worry was that, we have money, we have power, but do we have culture? The concern of the South Americans was, we have culture and we know more languages than English, but we're poor. Can we be leaders in culture when we are poor? And interestingly, the titles of the papers, Leopoldo Zea and others, the titles said, is there a Latin American philosophy? Is there a North American philosophy? A question that is still raised today, as you know. And so the discussion was around what would make a philosophy Latin American. Especially that, as you know, philosophy is supposed to be universal, i.e., independent of special circumstances such as language or location or geography. So how can you have a philosophy that is by nature universal and at the same time specific? So how do you answer the question, is there a Latin American philosophy? What do you look at? Does language make it specific? Does the tradition that comes from it? Or is it the set of problems? So a big discussion that is still going on today. Now, what I retained from this discussion, from this conference in 1947, is that it was South America that had bigger chances, according to the participants to the conference. In other words, even North Americans were saying, these people in South America, in Mexico and elsewhere, they know more languages, they have a very active cultural press, they are more in touch with Europe, so maybe we should learn from them. about 40 years later, in 1985, there was again a meeting I think they meet every 4 years, a meeting of the Inter-American Congress of Philosophy in Guadalajara, 1985. And by then, the rapport of forces had changed. And now the question was the hegemony of North America, the complaint about the dominance of English. And there was a big discussion, a big fight over, why should English be the dominating language? I'm raising this conference just to say that this question of how do we position ourselves vis-a-vis European philosophy, people who do philosophy outside Europe, is a long time question, has started in the Americas and has spread to other parts of the world, including Africa and the Arab world. This question of what kind of philosophy can we call our own? How do you construct a philosophy of your own? And here in my book on contemporary Arab thought, I identified a few primary concerns. I thought that if one follows the Latin American discussion, the big theme or the big concern, let me say, is imitation. In other words, in the case of Latin America, local languages have been erased. Local traditions, to a large extent, have been erased. You have been Europeanized on all levels almost: economic, religious, cultural, linguistic, and intellectual. And I remember in 1947, the Latin American philosophers were saying, what do we do other than just repeat what is being produced in Paris or in Madrid? We look like, copies of what is produced over there. So there is a big concern about imitation. What are we more than just imitations of Europe? In Africa, the concern was something else. It was about the very capability of doing philosophy. Because according to the European view of Africans, that Africans were really not made for logical thinking. And with the first reactions to this, that ideas of negritude sort of claimed that, saying, yes, we are different. We are not logical. We are more into rhythm, into feeling, into communication with nature, what have you. We are not Greek in the sense of reason is not our forte. So in the African debates, you see a lot of effort being deployed to prove that you have rational thinking, that even your proverbs, the discussion about ethnophilosophy, that in proverbs one can find that kind of rational wisdom. When you come to the Arab world, it's a different question. Arabs do not have that concern to show that they can philosophize because they have a fantastic philosophical tradition, but an old one. So Arab thinkers or Arab philosophers felt that they are very comfortable with that they don't need to prove that they can philosophize, and that they have a rich tradition of rational thinking. But that is situated in the past. So how do you reconnect with this past? And then how do you produce a philosophy of your own today? In other words, a contemporary Arab philosophy that is neither an echo of Western philosophy, nor just a repetition of the old philosophies of the medieval times. This was then the burden of contemporary Arab philosophers. How do you solve that? And like in other places, there was a concern with this authenticity business, no? Because once you say, I want a thought of my own, a philosophy of my own, you're saying, I don't want to be an imitation. I don't want to be a bad second copy. I don't want to be just repeating stuff. And philosophy at the end of the day is a rational reflection of one's affairs. So what are these affairs? And then how do you approach them? We know that also other parts of the world, including Latin America and Africa, spent quite a lot of time discussing authenticity. And the problem with authenticity, as you know, was that it can lead you to deadlocks like essentialism. And this was a long learning process in all of these societies to learn that ideas of authenticity can deprive you of agency and can put you into a deadlock of essentialism. So now you know what the preoccupation of contemporary Arab philosophy has been. You want to produce a philosophy of your own that reflects your own givens, your own thoughts, that deals with things of today, that is rooted in this past of yours, that relates or produces a modernity of your own, the other big difficult topic. So where is this modernity? It's in the West. So is that a modernity of your own? And how do you produce it? Is the modern the contemporary? I mean, you as a contemporary Arab, are you modern? Do you want to be modern? And what makes you modern? This challenge led many Arab thinkers and Arab philosophers to spend a lot of time with tradition. One trend that we can very well imagine said that, well, for rationality, which is crucial for philosophy and for modernity, we don't need to go to the West because we have a tradition of rationality in our past. We have fantastic philosophers, Averroes and others, who actually developed philosophies of rationality. What we need to do is to go back and sort out or choose from that tradition, from that legacy, trends of rationality upon which we can build. Now, the problem is that the very concept of reason changed. Left-leaning people said, well, let's go to tradition and draw from it elements of progressive thinking, materialist thinking along, Marxist lines. This produced, unfortunately, this was a huge effort, I don't know, hundreds of books and thousands of articles written in the 70s, 80s, 90s. To the extent that it became an obsession. And some people who criticized this whole trend thought that all this preoccupation with the past, with tradition, didn't really produce any scholarship. It's not that a lot of studies were made on manuscripts, the thousands of manuscripts that lie around, still lie around unstudied. Rather, it stayed at the level of superficial or not enough scholarly examination of this tradition. And it got reduced to an ideology, that the whole discussion about tradition became an ideological discussion. You wanted to, champion the idea that we have reason, we can prove that we have, we have been practicing it. And this obsession with tradition became, as I said, under severe criticism, to the point that there are now a trend that calls for studies of memory and studies of forgetfulness. That this exclusive concern with remembering the past has detached ourselves from life. Actually, we are busying ourselves with a an intellectual legacy that can no longer serve our life issues today. And this is why some people refer to Nietzsche's famous use and abuse of history, in the sense that we have really have fallen into some kind of an archaic relation to the past, and sort of championing it as a flag to say that we are here, we exist, we have a fantastic philosophy tradition. But also another problem was that much of what was referred to as tradition was the religious tradition, not so much the sciences. To some extent, yes, philosophy, but as I said, with a lot of problematic aspect to it, but a lot sort of trying to use the religious tradition as a foundation for contemporary intellectual production or philosophical production. I think that things changed by the end of the 20th century. By the 1990s, one could see that there was a shift, and this is what I try to describe a little bit in my book on contemporary Arab thought, that people were tired of this tradition business, were no longer lost totally interest in it for a lot of people. And that this whole concern with culture was no longer the primary concern. This is what I call, if you want, also the culturalism that dominated the latter half of the second half, the last quarter, let's say, of the 20th century. In other words, obviously, these were societies in a great crisis on all levels: economic, political, cultural. And so there was a lot of soul searching. And I think that this was the big crisis of the post-independence state. In other words, these independent states that we ended up having, and which were supposed to provide us with development, with progress, with social justice, with good education, with good health services, ended up really becoming disasters, dictatorships, no respect for human rights, failure on the development front, failure in education, failure in health. We witnessed, and this, when we say, I say we, I mean the literature, a lot of the literature express that disenchantment, the post-independence disenchantment, that all these expectations turned out to be non-existent, were not delivered. And we ended up having disaster areas, as we know today. So for many people, this interest in culture, in other words, to say that we are in a mess because we have a problem in culture, we are not modern enough, or we are too modernized and too westernized, or we have to go back to tradition, or we have to forget tradition. But all the discussions around what is wrong with us turned a lot about culture. However, there were also other voices who said actually early on that the real problem was political, and that this issue of identity was not really the real issue, and that what we wanted, not identity affirmation, but democracy, and that the problem was not in culture, it was in lack of political participation. And instead of pursuing essentialist view of identity, a lot of people called for agency affirmation. And this is what I sensed towards the late 90s. And there was a deep sense of discontent and impotence. That in fact, in the face of all this failure, it was not possible to change things. People had tried over decades to make demonstrations, to voice protests, to try and change regimes, and had failed. Basically, we were governed by more or less thugs, mafia-like, I mean, in the technical sense of the term, criminals, network of gangsters who were robbing the countries and destroying societies. And this is where humanism and enlightenment come into the picture. In those years preceding the Arab revolts, in the 1990s and in the 2000s, there were debates about enlightenment that I followed closely, especially in Cairo and Damascus. And I was eager to find out what these discourses were about. And I discovered that they were not at all about, studies of Rousseau or studies of Kant, or they were very much rooted in the realities of the Egyptian society and the Syrian society. And in this book, analyzing the different discourses in a nutshell, I discovered that what people meant by enlightenment was a sort of political humanism. In other words, that these post-independence states had destroyed the human being in a very concrete sense when you think of prisons, of absence of rule of law, of human rights, of economic disasters, of mismanagement of national wealth, and all of that. That failure had produced the destruction of the human being. And this word destruction is quite recurrent in this literature. And in a very concrete way, it's not a metaphor. And the people in these circles who discuss this enlightenment, theater writers, novelists, historians, sociologists, critical people, believe that the only way to rehumanize our societies is to stop this, i.e., introduce political participation. And in my book, I argue that this demand for enlightenment, what was called enlightenment, was very much echoed in the streets of Arab cities later on when the revolts erupted, as people demanded exactly that. They demanded political participation, the ousting of these criminals who are governing us, and the creation of conditions for social justice. So I ended up labeling or describing the enlightenment that was called for as political humanism. So the reconstruction of the human through political participation, through getting rid of dictatorships and establishing forms of democracy. Of course, as you know, these movements failed, and we are back into a terrible counter-revolution with the support of the international community, international governments, I should say, Western governments, and local regional governments. Now, I want also to add another note here. I reported about discussions in Cairo and in Egypt, discussions which were not framed in academic circles. I'm not talking about, universities organizing conferences or publishers calling for volumes, edited volumes. I'm talking about people who were, citizens and writers and social scientists and historians, and who were, writing around what was happening in the country. Now, the contexts are different. Cairo is not Damascus, and the Syrian context is different from the Egyptian context, as I explained. But there was this common thing that enlightenment meant, the reinstatement of the rehumanizing our societies. Parallel to these discussions, there were scholarly academic meetings. There are, for instance, 2 volumes which were published by a very famous publishing house in Beirut around enlightenment. And what amuses me or fascinates me is the difference between what was being said about enlightenment in these scholarly settings and in the non-scholarly settings. So when we speak of the intellectual Arab scene, the contemporary intellectual scene, it's a very differentiated scene. It's not everybody saying the same thing. In those scholarly circles, we were still in the tradition West business. And the discussions went, if I want to present them schematically, the scheme was the following. Enlightenment, yes, but we want to have our own enlightenment. Enlightenment is the West, and we have our tradition. So we have to be very careful not to follow, just, adapt Western discourses uncritically. And we need to make use of our own tradition. And then we need to be careful with ideology. We shouldn't politicize this notion. So 3 concepts that dominate this scholarly enlightenment. The West, tradition, non-politics, no politicization. It's as if, when I want to be nasty, I say it's as if, you press the button, you say enlightenment, and hop, immediately you have the West tradition, non-ideological approach. We need to be, objective and scholarly and think about it in a very rational way. For the other people, the non-academic, neither the West nor tradition comes out at all. And it is heavily political. Enlightenment is politics in this context. And as I said, primarily the demand for political participation. And again, to go back to the streets of our cities, we all watched these demonstrations, so I don't need to prove it. It's out there. We didn't see people going out on the streets and say, we want our tradition. Our main demand is that we have lost our authenticity. We want to affirm our identity. We don't like the West. None of that. Not because people thought the West was a good thing for us. Of course not. But because people were primarily concerned, understood from their point of view, that the problem was the way we were governed by our own people. It was not, the issue was not identity affirmation. It was not, to salvage our tradition. It was to get rid of criminals who govern us, to seek better governance, to have a rule of law, to hold politicians accountable, that people have the prerogative to hold those in power accountable. So it amuses me, it strikes me, if you want, to see that this discussion of enlightenment towards the end of the 20th century in the Arabic-speaking world takes different shapes. My reading, it's my thesis, that scholars, some scholars at least, spend their time reproducing a certain discourse, are not very connected with reality, are not very concerned, or they have this, this elitist kind of discipline-connected philosophy, and so they reproduce discourses, whereas other people who are more in touch with reality or are writing in interaction with reality produce a different concept of enlightenment. So I think I will stop here with this panorama, which is my own. I might be wrong, but I try to prove this point of view in my books. And this is how things look like from my point of view. And I will stop here and welcome your comments, objections, questions, whatever.
Thank you very much, Professor Elizabeth, for your very, very interesting conference. It was very good to hear. We already have some questions, so I'm gonna ask you, and then maybe we can have more. Jerzy wrote, do you feel that in your academic milieu, there is a pressure to publish internationally? In Brazil, there is a big push towards the internationalization of academia. I believe this factor greatly hinders the development of a local philosophical identity. Do you believe there is a sense in which a local philosophy identity can stand out in a globalized academic landscape?
Good question. This is what also connects us with you. We suffer from the same thing. Now, let me look at it from an academic point of view. What is academic liberation? What is scholarly liberation? Is there a sociology of one's own? What would that mean? Are there social sciences of one's own? What would that be? What is the significance of language here? And the interconnectedness, I mean, say you want to be an Arab sociologist. What does that mean? Does it mean for you to be an Arab? And what does that mean? You speak Arabic? You live in an Arab country? Have you been trained in Arab universities? And then this business of course, we have the same too. You have to publish in Arabic. We want to push, local production, which is a very good idea. But in our global and interconnected world, how do you do that when, obviously, when you want to become a sociologist, you go to the West or you apply Western. I mean, you cannot ignore Western science? Who will finance your research? If your own government finances it, and given what kind of governments we have, what is the margin of freedom and honesty that you could practice? So maybe it's better to get money from the West, and at least you know what the parameters are, than getting money, I don't know, from the Egyptian government or the Syrian government, if any, and be totally subjected in a much more direct way to the dictates of that state. So it's a very complex matter. And what does it mean to be, Arab? Does it mean to be isolated? Do we have anything to say? What about the community of scholars? To which community of scholars do we belong? And here, of course, the South-South connection, that perhaps I have less to share with the Belgian philosopher than with a Latin American philosopher or an African philosopher. But how much do we connect with each other? It's in the West that we meet. Very often it's at Western conferences, in North American conferences, that you get to meet people from the third world. So it's a very complex question, and there is no easy answer to it. I think we need to do both. We need, on the one hand, to stay connected, not to fall into provincialism, and to be subjugated to our local hegemonies, which are quite evil. Western hegemony is bad, but there is also local hegemony. We want to push forward our own works with our own agendas and our own priorities, with our own approaches, or tweaked approaches, but at the same time, we want to stay connected, be able to share notes with people around the world. I mean, we can't, say we isolate ourselves and happy to be ourselves. Complex issue.
Yeah, no doubt. As I told you before, I'm especially interested in ecofeminism. And when I started learning about these issues, I was studying especially North Americans ecofeminists. And then I spent some years studying, learning from them. And then I started to write about what I think in my context, what would be a Latin American or a Brazilian ecofeminism. And now I want people to know, I know people from the North to know about what we are developing here about these issues. But then we have these issues of languages and where we want to publish, who we want to talk about this. And it's I think it's very difficult to talk about this. It's very complex, but it's something that we are facing at this time. So as you told us in the beginning of your conference, that you see now these different periods in the development of an Arab philosophy. We are also facing this now. We are developing our knowledge here and sharing with other people. So
well, the bad side,
that we are here talking from this connection from the South.
The bad side is that it's difficult. The good side is that it calls upon us really to it pushes our capabilities. It pushes us to learn languages. It pushes us to go to international conferences, to be in touch with people outside our region, and at the same time be very anchored. And so be critical towards the inside and the outside, and feminists have mastered this, I think. So it's difficult, but we can manage. We should be able to manage, I think. I think Daniela's froze.
Yeah, I think I am here. So I don't know if we can go back to the questions. I don't know if we are on the screen right now. Are we? Okay. Okay, so
I'm back.
okay,
so
you're back.
I'm so sorry. We have to deal with that kind of things here, doing philosophy with bad connections, bad internet connections. We have to connect.
Bad internet connections, because we have very good connections.
Yes.
Very good feminist connections. Yes.
Yes. Yeah, thanks, Janine. So we already have other questions, and the next one is from Janine. So it would seem that once we are colonized, we are in a dead end about a philosophy of our own. But isn't it the search for an independent local autochthonous philosophy also European reproductive research? Oh, sorry, search.
Can you repeat the question, please? Because it got muted from time to time. I couldn't hear the whole question. Can you repeat it?
Okay. So yeah, we are very in a very bad internet connection now. So just internet connection. It is my own question that I will read again then to you, because I was thinking it will seem that once we are colonized, we are in a very dead end about philosophy of our own. But my question is this: isn't the search for an independent, local, autochthonous philosophy also a European reproductive search? Could we say that?
So you're saying the idea of having an autonomous philosophy is itself a European idea? Not really. I don't think so. And, you know, much as identity is a boring and is an awful idea, and more people are saying, you know, we're tired of this, and especially in a global world, and especially with all the fascism that comes with it, that we should really give up on the idea of identity. My sense, from what I see, and I being myself a girl from the South, I think that we need to have a sense of self. That we do have our own problems that are different from, you know, the problems of other people elsewhere. Some problems are common, some problems are not common. And I don't give up on that sense of self, you know, to have a thought of your own, an art of your own. And what does that mean is a big, of course, a question to be unpacked. And maybe societies like ours have learned how complex this is. But it is not, I don't think that it is a European, another European idea. But maybe I should think about it more. Maybe you should explain more what you mean.
Well, maybe it's not a denial of identity, not that. It's a denial of some kind of a certain conception of identity or autonomy or independent rationality that we need to avoid if we want to talk about a philosophy of our own. So maybe if we want to talk about a certain self or local philosophy, we need to take a gap to certain conceptions of European philosophy. Maybe this is my point. It was not very clear in the beginning, but this is actually my point. Not denial of an identity, of course, or like a local identity.
I agree. And I think that our societies, again, learned that, you start from this obvious idea that, yes, you don't want to speak like a French and write like a French and produce, studies in philosophy like a French. Yes, but then what does it mean to produce a philosophy of your own? Then you discover how complex the matter is. And I agree with you that then notions of autonomy, notions of independence, and notions of identity have to be unpacked and looked at very critically. I agree with that, yes.
Okay. I will read another question that we have here. Danielle is back, but I will go on for a little while. So then actually, then Danielle can come back to you in a moment. Jordan is asking, well, he's saying, thanks for the rich presentation. When you speak in imitation of European philosophy of a form of rationality that also served to justify colonialism, do you mean that instead of thinking about our reality, we are parroting liberal normative fantasies that disregard how we got here as targets of colonial exploitation and expropriation? There is an example. For example, there is only one Black author, Fanon, in the Honnet's struggle for recognition references. Where is the recognition, actually? It's a connected question to mine, actually.
There isn't, I don't know if I understand the question correctly, but it is not true that there is only Fanon. There is the whole, South, what we call today Global South. I call it in an old-fashioned way, the Third World. There is a fantastic universe of discourse that has learned, that has gone through that learning process, that has become critical on many fronts vis-a-vis what we have tried, how we have tried to deal with the questions, and vis-a-vis the West, and in our case, vis-a-vis the past and the tradition we are sort of connected to. I think that no, there is a fantastic set of discourses that, as I said, like what I find in the Arab world, it's not taught enough. It's not, disseminated enough. I think we don't know enough the critical thinking that our own people have produced in the last couple of centuries. Now, whether it's because we think like Europeans that we have been colonized by Europeans, is it? I'm not sure if this is the question. I mean, I think colonizers colonized us and then colonized our minds and robbed us in the first place and enslaved us. And I think we are aware of that. Now, do we have to be critical of liberal capitalism, Western liberal capitalism? Definitely, because we are the first ones to pay the price for it. If I understood the question correctly.
Yeah, I think so. We are waiting for more questions, but I'm still thinking about some things you said, and which are very close to problems we are facing here, and especially in our relations to in our reflections about this colonized philosophy. And in the discussion about enlightenment, it seems to me you emphasized a gap between academy and society, or the outside of academy. Is it so? Is it still so? Do you still feel that there is no conversation between academy and other intellectuals outside academy?
I don't want to make, very definitive statements about this. I'm saying that what I notice is that there are different circles, different intellectual circles that behave differently, and at least some circles keep reproducing. They are usually men. They talk to each other, they answer each other, and they reproduce a set of preoccupations and questions that do not reflect always the concerns, the most pressing concerns of society. Now, what are these pressing concerns is another business, of course. And so I'm making very cautious judgments here. But in the case of this Enlightenment discussion, I could see that there are different approaches and the trap of the scholarly setting is that, you have certain ways of dealing with the question, and you keep on reproducing it. Whereas outside strict academia, I think there is more creativity, more room for different discourses. This business of reproducing is less now. I'm not saying that it happens in everywhere outside academia, no, but I'm saying that it's interesting to notice how different pockets, different milieus produce different discourses. And I would love to have a milieu study or a Bourdieu study of this philosophy and this thought. Unfortunately, in the Arab world, as I say in my talks, I complain always that we don't have enough sociology of knowledge, social history of academic circles or publishing houses. So we know little about the socio-political, economic, historical circumstances that produce certain intellectual milieus and intellectual discourses.
Okay, thank you very much. I have another question here from Daniela, and then I think I'm gonna lend back the word to Daniela herself, because she can close the talk too. As a surrogate, I'm going to the backstage again. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks, Janini, for helping us in being here and the support. I'm back. I hope I'm going to stay this time. And I'm so sorry for the inconvenience. Well, I'd like to ask you, Professor, if you have already thought about a place for environmental and maybe animal issues, this political humanism, or we have this question of focusing on human beings, and what do you mean about humanism? Like these values, not maybe it doesn't have to be anthropocentric, but how would you see the relations between humans and other than humans could be in order to have this more ethical and just relations? So I think that's kind of a question.
Very, very good question, Daniela. Indeed, when we say humanize or political humanism, what about other creatures? a very good question. You know, we're so concerned with the humans right now that I think our imagination there is no room for further, for widening our thinking here. But you're absolutely spot on. And I think that one of the things, the damages that our states produce is environmental damage. Because the gangsterism that rules our part of the world made it such that, as you can see in the Arab region, there are huge environmental disasters from which humans suffer, but definitely other creatures as well. So no, so far I haven't seen much writing on eco-humanism or eco-feminism. I think we haven't really developed that yet, or that I don't know enough about it. But it's a very, very good point. Thank you. I will add that to my list of concerns. Thank you.
Thank you too. And I thought about women in developing this other kind of relations with not only social perspective, but also a social and environmental perspective. So, and from an ecofeminist people and environmental problems. So I think it would be good to think about this issue. Very difficult because we are dealing with all this and social disparities.
Is it possible that if she closes the camera, then her voice would improve? I don't know.
Okay, the surrogate is going back.
No problem.
No problem. Well, I don't know exactly what she was talking about, but she was talking about the dealings of around facing ecological problems in Brazil. So I'm not going to repeat her own talk because I don't know exactly the point of her argument. But as we are going to the end of the session, I'm going just to close and to thank you and to say that it was really, really interesting for me. I learned a lot. I have a lot of questions yet to think maybe with you and maybe from you. And I was laughing actually before because I was sort of looking forward an answer and you actually gave me the confirmation that maybe the answer is just realizing and perception of complexity. There is no single answer to the whole of this colonial process in philosophy here in South America or in the Arab world. So I don't know if you want to comment a final comment on this issue of complexity.
Listen, I think complexity is difficult, is tiring, but it is also, it gives us the advantage over others. Because it pushes us, we're forced to be aware of things that perhaps somebody sitting in Europe comfortably and not having these complexities wouldn't be, you wouldn't have it. And so I think these are challenges that we should accept and we should embrace and we should deploy our talents. And I always think of third world feminism. And because in third world feminism, all of these complexities come together, not only the feminist issues, but the cultural issues, the autonomy issues. And this is why you find brilliant writings coming from third world feminists and beyond. I mean, all these frontline situations we are thrown in, I think these are chances to develop brilliant answers or brilliant approaches and offer perhaps levels of awareness of critical thinking that others cannot. So I think it is our predicament. We haven't chosen it. But okay, since we have these problems and challenges, I think it's also an occasion to really push thinking further and together. And you're absolutely right. I'm delighted, to have had this conversation, and I think we should have more of it. And once COVID is gone, we should get together. So I thank you once again and wish you all the best.
Yes, hopefully we can face and talk in face to face. Yes, hopefully. I'm very glad to hear from you that you the same kind of hope in third world feminism and about our knowing how to deal with complexity in a very and courageous way. So yeah, very glad to hear.
Absolutely. All the best to you.
Yes, thank you very much. We are going to end the session then. And I would like to thank all of you, Daniela, who is here and sharing the session with me. Together, we are companions in the ecofeminist fight. So I would like to thank Talita, who is here also in the technical support, and Gustavo, yes, who is saying to us, please come back.
Yes. Okay, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. All the best to you too. Thank you.